Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the medical concept with Dr. Falak. Today we will discuss the functions of specific areas of the cerebral cortex. Although the cortex appears as a continuous structure, it is actually highly organized with different regions specialized for particular functions. Today we will cover three things. First, the motor and sensory areas of the cortex very briefly. Then, how association areas help in higher brain functions. And finally, the clinical effects of cortical damage. Brain has three main divisions, the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. The cerebrum consists of two cerebral hemispheres, the outer layer of which is known as the cortex, and there are four lobes in the cortex, the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. In addition to this anatomical mapping, it is equally important to understand that the brain also is having a functional map. Now let's quickly summarize the function of four lobes of the brain. Frontal lobe. It controls the movement and governs executive functions like planning, behavior, and decision making. Anterior parietal lobe detects sensation, while posterior parietal lobe interprets and integrates it. Temporal lobe integrates sound, language, meaning, vision, memory into meaningful experiences, while occipital lobe receives visual inputs and convert them into meaningful visual perceptions. Now this slide summarizes the main functions of the cortical areas. First, the motor areas that are responsible for the movement, specifically controlling individual muscles. Second, the sensory areas that receive and process different types of sensory information like touch, pain, and temperature. And finally, the association areas that are responsible for handling higher functions such as language, vision, recognizing object in space, and overall awareness. So in simple terms, motor areas act, sensory areas feel, and association areas help us to understand and interpret. Cortical areas can be broadly divided into motor, sensory, and association areas. Now let's first briefly discuss the motor areas. The first is the primary motor cortex that is organized somatotopically. The medial and the superior regions, they control the movement of the lower limbs, while the lateral areas, they control the trunk, upper limb, and the head. Each hemisphere governs motor activity on the opposite side of the body. Then comes the premotor area. It plans and prepares movement in response to external sensory inputs such as the visual and auditory cues. In contrast, the supplementary motor area organizes and initiates complex movement based on internal cues including memory. Now coming to the sensory areas. The primary sensory areas, they detect specific sensations like visual, auditory or somatic that are transmitted to the brain from peripheral sensory organs. The secondary sensory areas, they are responsible for the analysis of specific sensations like interpretation of the shape or texture of an object in one's hand, interpretation of the color, light intensity, direction of the lines and angles, and other aspect of vision, as well as interpretation of the meaning of the sound tones and sequence of tones in the auditory signal. There are many other areas in the cerebral cortex that are involved in higher functions such as language, memory, decision making and behavior. They are actually related with association area. And what are association area? They are certain areas that does not fit into the broader category of the primary and secondary, so they are referred to as association area. They actually integrate information to produce meaningful responses. So understanding how these areas work is essential because damage to a specific region leads to characteristic clinical deficit, allowing us to recognize and localize various brain functions. Now it has four main areas. Number one is the parieto-occipito-temporal area, prefrontal cortex, limbic area, and area of facial recognition. So these association areas are very important as far as your exam point is concerned. So you have to remember their name. And lesions of any association cortex is actually a complex deficit. It's not a simple loss. Now this is the first and major association areas and it shows the parieto-occipito-temporal association area. This area is responsible for integrating information from different sensory regions and giving it a meaning. It has several important sub-areas. Again remember the parieto-occipito-temporal association area is functionally divided into further sub-areas, right? Okay, the first is the spatial coordination area that helps us to understand our position with respect to surrounding. Second, Wernicke's area, it is involved in language comprehension. Another area processes the visual forms of word, allowing us to read. And finally, the naming area that helps us to identify and name the object. So overall, this region is essential for understanding, interpreting, and making sense of sensory information. Now let's discuss the first sub-functional area of the parieto-occipito-temporal association area, that is the spatial area or spatial coordination area. This area is located in the posterior parietal cortex and is responsible for the spatial awareness. It receives visual, somatosensory and vestibular input which are integrated to form a spatial map of the body and its surrounding. This information is then distributed to different regions such as the premotor cortex for guiding movement, the frontal eye field for eye movement and attention, and the prefrontal cortex for the spatial planning. It also contributes to awareness via the limbic system and is integrated across both hemispheres. Overall, this area helps us understand where our body is in the space and how we interact with our environment. Clinically, lesion in this region cause contralateral spatial neglect syndrome, where the patient ignores one side of the space. For example, he or she may leave food on one side of the plate, he can dress only one side, or drawing incomplete objects. Now coming to the second and the most important area, that is Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is located in the posterior-superior temporal gyrus near the auditory cortex and responsible for the language comprehension. It helps us to understand both spoken and written language by integrating auditory as well as visual inputs and interpreting their meaning. For example, whatever I am speaking to you and what you people are getting about it, it's all because of your intact Wernicke's area. Okay, clinically damage to this area, it causes Wernicke's aphasia, where speech remains fluent but lacks meaning, comprehension is impaired, and the patients are often unaware of their deficit. There is another term that is known as global aphasia, and when the lesion in the Wernicke's area is widespread and it extends backward to the angular gyrus, or it can extend up to the lower areas of the temporal lobe, or to the superior border of the Sylvan fissure, the person is likely to be almost totally demented for language understanding or even communication, and therefore he is said to have global aphasia. Now coming to the area of visual processing of the word. Right, this area is located in the occipito-temporal region and is responsible for reading. It converts visual information into meaningful language, allowing us to understand the written words. This information is then sent to Wernicke's area for further comprehension. Clinically, damage to this area results in alexia. Okay, it results in alexia and agraphia if also angular gyrus is affected. Okay, in this condition the patient cannot read or write, but they can still understand the spoken language. Now coming to another important area of the parieto-occipito-temporal association area, and this is object naming area. Okay, so this area is located in the occipito-temporal region and responsible for naming objects. It links what we see, hear or feel with language, allowing us to identify object by name. Clinically, damage to this area causes anomia. Okay, it's known as anomia, where the person can recognize object but he cannot name them, right? While the rest of the speech remains normal. Now come to another major association area, that is the prefrontal association area. Okay, this area is responsible for higher executive functions. It helps in planning, decision making, working memory and controlling behavior. Example, it essentially converts thoughts into action. It also uses processed sensory information to guide complex movements and behavior. Clinically, lesions can produce frontal lobe syndrome. Dorsolateral damage leads to poor planning and memory deficit. Orbitofrontal damage causes disinhibition and impulsive behavior, while damage to the medial frontal area, it will lead to apathy and loss of motivation. Now there is another important area in the frontal association area, and this is known as Broca's area, right? So Broca's area is located in the inferior frontal gyrus of the dominant hemisphere and is responsible for the motor speech production. It plans and generates the movement required for speaking and converts thoughts into spoken word. It works in close association with Wernicke's area, which is responsible for language comprehension. Clinically, damage to Broca's area causes non-fluent aphasia, where speech becomes slow and effortful, but comprehension is relatively preserved. Remember, what was the fluent aphasia? Yes, it was because of the damage to Wernicke's area, while Broca's aphasia is actually a non-fluent aphasia. Now coming to the third major association area, that is the limbic area. The limbic association area is involved in emotions, behavior and motivation. It links our emotional state with our actions and play a key role in decision making and social behavior. It also interacts with the hypothalamus and brain stem to produce autonomic responses and with the hippocampus for memory. Clinically, lesions in this area will lead to emotional disturbance, behavioral changes and lack of motivation. Next, we have area of facial recognition. This is the fourth and the most important association area, but it is actually present at the base of the brain, right? And where it is located? It's located in the fusiform gyrus of the occipito-temporal region, and is responsible for recognizing faces, right? It allows us to identify familiar individuals and link visual information with emotional and memory related inputs from the limbic system. Okay, for example, if we see our friend and we become very happy by recognizing him or her. Clinically, damage to this area, it is going to cause prosopagnosia. What? Prosopagnosia, where the patient cannot recognize faces despite having normal vision. This area actually answers the question, not just what I am seeing, but who I am seeing. Patient can describe a face, but they cannot recognize the person. Can you tell me the difference between face recognizing area and the naming area we have just discussed previously? Actually, face area, it recognizes identity, while the naming area, it assigns a name. One tells you who it is, the other tells you what to call it. In summary, the cortex has motor area for movement and sensory area for perception. The association areas integrate this information. The parieto-occipito-temporal region is responsible for the spatial awareness and language-related functions. The prefrontal cortex controls planning and behavior. The limbic system governs emotions and motivation. And the fusiform area, it helps us recognizing the face. Clinically, damage to these areas produce characteristic deficits like aphasia, neglect syndrome, personality changes, and prosopagnosia. Now let's discuss some important questions which will help you in your clinical exams and even in your theory exams. Now let's study this one. A 62-year-old right-handed man presents with progressive difficulty in speaking and understanding language. On examination, he demonstrates slow but effortful speech with intact comprehension, but he struggles to form grammatically correct sentences. MRI reveals a lesion in the dominant hemisphere. Now tell me, which cortical area is most likely affected in this patient? Now tell me, what is your answer? Yes. Okay, so the most likely answer is yes, it's Broca's area, option number A. So why not other areas? For example, just take the prefrontal cortex. This is associated with the behavior, personality, not speech production. Take an example of primary motor cortex. It is actually related with the weakness, not language deficit. And what about primary auditory cortex? It's related with the hearing, right? Not language processing. And what about Wernicke's area? It is associated with the fluent but meaningless speech and poor comprehension. So in this case, the proper answer is Broca's area, right? Now coming to the second question. A 55-year-old woman is brought to the clinic by her family because she has become disorganized, impulsive, and unable to plan her daily activities over the past few months. She often makes improper or inappropriate social comments, forget appointments, and has difficulty solving simple problems like balancing her checkbook. Neurological examination is otherwise normal. So tell me, which area is mostly affected in this lady? So tell me. Take your time. Yes. Okay, so the answer is, yes, anybody? The answer is beta prefrontal cortex. Okay, so prefrontal cortex is disturbed or damaged, or a lesion is present in this prefrontal cortex, right? Okay, now why not other options? Just take an example of Broca's area. Broca's area is associated with speech production. Okay, it's associated with the motor speech production, so this is not the thing. Then comes the this one, posterior parietal cortex. It is actually associated with the spatial neglect, means what is the position of our body with respect to the surrounding. So this is not the case. Then what about Wernicke's area? It's actually a comprehension problem. And visual processing area, it's actually related with the reading and visual deficit, but not this one. Like, so this is all related with the personality disorder, and they likely to indicate the problem in the prefrontal cortex. So very good. Now let's to the final question. Now coming to the third and the final question, a 58 years old right-handed woman is brought in her by family because she cannot recognize the faces of her relative, even though she can identify people by their voices. She also struggles to name common objects, although she can describe their functions. Her vision and hearing are intact. MRI shows a lesion in the inferior temporal lobe of the dominant hemisphere. Which of the following condition best describe her deficit? Now just think and read the question again, and then you will get the answer. So what's the answer? Yes, the answer is prosopagnosia. Okay, why not other options? Because anomia is the inability of a person to call the name of the object. Okay, alexia is that a person is unable to read. Agraphia, a person cannot write. And aphasia, the person cannot speak. Okay, so here the correct option is prosopagnosia. So thank you so much for your concentration, and inshallah we will be coming with a new concept in our new video. Okay, so just like and subscribe. See you next time. Allah Hafiz.